In Plato's The Apology of Socrates, the Socrates character recounts the story of his friend Chaerephon going to the oracle of Delphi and being told by the oracle that Socrates is the wisest of all men. Socrates was perplexed by this revelation, for he trusted the insight of the oracle, but at the same time he was aware that he indeed knew nothing, and therefore wondered how a man who knew nothing could also be the wisest. According to Plato's Socrates character, this began his search for a wise man to bring to the oracle as evidence that there are those who are wiser than himself. However, after having discussions with men who were known to be wise, which are detailed in many of Plato's dialogues, he concluded that none of these men, although giving the appearance of possessing knowledge, possessed any more knowledge than he himself. He concluded that he is indeed the wisest of all men because, although he knows nothing, he is aware of his lack of knowledge, while others falsely believe that they have knowledge. However, although Plato's Socrates claims to know nothing, he makes many bold knowledge claims in several of Plato's dialogues. For example, in Plato's Apology, Socrates claims, "I do know, however, that it is wicked and shameful to do wrong. It is the greatest good for man to discuss virtue, and most famously, the unexamined life is not worth living for man. What I say is true." And in Plato's Gorgias, Socrates states, "I am sure that if you agree with me in any of the opinions which my soul forms, I have at last found the truth indeed." Also, there is Plato's so-called theory of forms, in which Socrates argues that the physical world is an illusion that poorly mirrors or participates in the perfect, unchanging realm of idealistic forms. And there is Socrates' continual claim that we possess immortal souls. That is quite a few knowledge claims for one who proclaims he knows nothing. So there are several possible reasons that Plato's Socrates adamantly affirms his own ignorance, yet contradictorily makes several knowledge claims throughout Plato's dialogues. Some believe that Socrates was only pretending to be ignorant to bait his interlocutors into admitting their own lack of knowledge. Many of Plato's dialogues start with Socrates first humbly stating his ignorance before engaging in debate, and then asking his debater to define X, Y, or Z, and then showing the shortcomings with each one of the given definitions. Socrates' humble claim to ignorance would often give the opponent a false sense of confidence, which would lead them more easily into Socrates' trap wherein he exposed their ignorance, after which Socrates then dominated the argument, or so it has been argued. Another explanation for Socrates' seemingly contradictory statement about his own ignorance is that Socrates' truth claims in Plato's dialogues are actually Plato's claims and he is only using Socrates as a mouthpiece for some of his ideas. In this view, we could see Socrates as providing a method of discourse to weed out misconceptions, and then Plato filling in the gaps with his own ideas. In the chapter, Socrates and the Early Dialogues, From the Cambridge Companion to Plato, Terry Penner argues that we can distinguish between Plato's dialogues that express Socrates' views and those that express Plato's views. Using Aristotle as a source, Penner argues that Socrates' concerns are mostly about living an ethically good life, with little interest in the nature of reality. These early dialogues showcase a playful Socrates and often end with the matter at hand undecided, or in aporia, Greek for impasse or puzzlement, with no explicit conclusions drawn. These endings are consistent with Socrates' claim of ignorance. However, Plato's later dialogues, according to Penner, often draw explicit conclusions that showcase more of Plato's ideas. Penner points out that Plato's longtime student Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, states that Plato was highly influenced by both Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Aristotle writes that a young Plato had adopted the Heraclitean idea that reality is indeterminate and in a constant state of flux. Plato also adopted the Pythagoreans' notion that abstract numbers are the basis of all reality, except that for Plato it is his forms that are the universal basis of reality. When we combine these two opposing views, we get the framework for Plato's theory of forms, a picture of reality that contains an indeterminate and illusory physical existence, along with the ideal and perfect true reality of forms behind the facade of the physical world. Furthermore, the Pythagoreans believed in the immortality and transmigration of the soul, which is also a belief that Plato adopts. Therefore, Penner concludes any claims in the dialogues dealing with these concepts are likely Plato's claims via the influence of the Heracliteans and Pythagoreans, not the views of Socrates. Another possible explanation for Socrates' contradiction is that some of his truth statements are not meant to be taken literally per se, but are instead meant to provide multiple interpretations. For example, during his trial in the Apology, Socrates claims that one ought not fear death because we do not know what happens after death. Either the body and soul cease to exist, which will bring an end to suffering and anxiety, or the soul continues to exist after the body dies, in which case no death has really occurred. This agnostic view of death and the fate of the soul is consistent with Socrates' claim to ignorance. In the same dialogue, Socrates states that one who fears death and tries desperately to escape execution is shameful and is not an honorable man. Later, while Socrates' followers are visiting him in prison and mourning his imminent execution, as dramatized in Plato's Phaedo, a cheerful Socrates says to them that they should stop weeping, for true philosophers do not fear death and do not mourn the dying, echoing his attitude towards death that he expressed at his trial. However, he then gives several arguments for the immortality of the soul, a clear contradiction to his earlier agnostic claims about what happens after death. Several points should be elucidated here. Socrates, at the beginning of the Pheado, says that he has been spending his time in prison adopting some of Aesop's fables into verse. Also, Socrates asks the men to take his wife Xantippe away, because she is sobbing uncontrollably. At the end of the dialogue, after Socrates has ingested the hemlock that will kill him, the visitors break out in tears. Socrates scolds them and states, "What is this strange outcry? I sent away the women mainly in order that they might not offend in this way. Be quiet then, and have patience." Now let's consider Socrates' arguments for the soul's immortality that he delivers to the visitors in his cell, one of which features an early manifestation of Plato's so-called theory of forms, and another which discusses reincarnation. One could take these as real theories that Socrates considers true. But why hasn't Socrates simply repeated what he had said during his trial in the Apology, that one should not fear dying since we have no knowledge of what happens after death? Next, remember that Socrates felt a kind of scorn for men who feared and wept at the idea of death, and even had his own wife removed from his execution after she wouldn't stop weeping. One could argue that Socrates' visitors, who weep throughout the Phaedo dialogue and who break out in sobs near the end, were not, to Socrates, honorable men who could handle the ambiguity of death, and therefore, like children, they needed stories or tales to pacify them. This interpretation becomes reasonable in the dialogue when, while Socrates is arguing for the immortality of the soul, his friends Simmias and Cebes express concern that the soul might scatter away at the death of the body, conveying a materialist view. Simmias states, "I cannot get rid of the feeling that when the man dies the soul may be scattered and that this may be the end of her." Socrates replies, "Like children, you are haunted with a fear that when the soul leaves the body, the wind may really blow her away and scatter her, especially if a man should happen to die in stormy weather." Notice that Socrates says their fears are childish, and he even adds in the sarcastic remark about stormy weather, mocking their concerns. Cebes replies, "Then Socrates, you must argue us out of our fears, and yet strictly speaking, they are not our fears. But there is a child within us to whom death is a sort of hobgoblin, him too we must persuade not to be afraid when he is alone with him in the dark." To which Socrates replies, "Let the voice of the charmer be applied daily until you have charmed him away." The word charm is used later in the dialogue as well, when Socrates asked if they would like to hear a charming tale, after which he describes the popular Greek notion of the afterlife, where some souls are punished and others rewarded in Hades. Here it could reasonably be argued that Socrates is telling tales to charm his visitors' childlike fears away rather than presenting sincere arguments, as he would with one who is brave enough to handle the uncertainty in the face of death. Plato had thought it important, at the beginning of the dialogue, to include the detail that Socrates had been adopting fables for the last few days, fables being easy to understand morality tales written for children and the masses. At the beginning of the dialogue, when asked why he was adopting these fables, Socrates said that throughout his life he had had a recurring dream that urged him to compose music. Socrates at first thought this was a reference to the philosophy he was already doing. However, upon reflection, he came to think the dream was more literal and telling him to compose popular music, this being the reason that he adopted some of Aesop's fables into verse. Given all of this evidence, it is possible that Socrates' arguments for the immortality of the soul could really be nothing more than fables, songs or tales that he created for these men to charm them away from their fear of death, and not real arguments at all. If they are fables or songs and not knowledge claims, then Socrates has not contradicted his famous assertion of ignorance, for fables and songs are not meant to be statements of knowledge in the strict sense. It should also be noted that Socrates wrote none of his ideas down, for he believed that writing was a poor way to communicate and explore ideas. To Socrates, once one writes down an argument, the reader simply absorbs or rejects the idea in with little engagement, and the author has no chance to defend the thesis or develop it further. To Socrates, philosophy is constant questioning and searching. This may be another reason that Plato includes these surface contradictions and opportunities for multiple readings in his dialogues. The reader has to figure out for him or herself what they believe, sifting through the claims, disagreeing here, questioning there, being puzzled in places, rather than passively processing one-sided arguments. To summarize, we have seen that, on the surface, Plato's Socrates may appear to contradict himself about his own ignorance by making knowledge claims in several of Plato's dialogues. These include ethical statements and also metaphysical statements about the theory of forms and the nature of the soul. However, it could be that some of these statements are being used ironically by Socrates to disarm his interlocutors, or are Plato's theories put into the Socrates character's mouth, which perhaps can be distinguished from the historical Socrates theories. Or they are fables or tales meant to provide different interpretations for different readers and to engage them and encourage them to think for themselves and draw their own conclusions. Whichever way we handle these contradictions, it is important to remember that Socrates in Plato's dialogues not only represents the historical teacher of Plato, but is also a literary character utilized by the latter who masterfully weaves allusion, symbolism, metaphor, allegory, and irony into his works, and the Socrates character is not exempt from these artistic and rhetorical choices.